Today's speaker, Mark Larson, first appeared on this stage almost exactly 3 years ago to the date, the early days of what would be a 4.5-year process, to share with us some of the first stories he had collected for his oral history project on the Chicago theater scene. In fact, we had the honor of being the first group with whom he had shared these stories. His newly released book, Ensemble, is an in-depth history of Chicago's internationally celebrated theater scene, spanning 65 years and told through first-person accounts of some 300 producers, directors, playwrights, actors, and more. We are thrilled to have him back this morning to tell us more. So please help me welcome Mark.
Thank you. Thank you. As Sherry said, I was here 3 years ago, and here's evidence. It was almost exactly 3 years to the day, which is stunning to me. And I stood right there, and I was absolutely terrified because I felt like I knew nothing about my topic at all. I was just barely over a year into it. And I was so self-conscious, I thought every single person in the audience is going to know stuff that I don't know. And so I sort of humbled up to it like, what I ended up doing was overdoing it, because what I started doing was constantly saying, this is my first talk on this, and I repeated that about 12 times. And I would say, you may know more than I do, just to give them that out. But it's wonderful to be back. And Sherry, thank you so much for the invitation back. I hope I know more than I did when I was first here. As she said, I've conducted over 300 interviews trying to figure out how this incredible Chicago theater community came to be. There are something like 250 theaters in this city. 250 theaters. And more, depending on how you count them. That's what people tell me. Some that come and go and that kind of thing. But that's astonishing. And I was really fascinated to find out how in the world did that happen? Because when I started, I tried to break into the theater here. And when I started, there was almost nothing going on. In fact, I want to acknowledge, don't forgive me for acknowledging you without warning, John Goodman is here. John Goodman was the drummer. Not the actor. Huh? Oh yeah, I don't want you to get excited. But when I tell you who he really is, you're really going to be excited. I was hired to do by hired, I mean I was paid about $50 a week, a children's show for Second City. And it ran every Sunday. And can I use a bad word? Yes. Yeah. Please do. Is that what your tone was? If you've been to Second City, you hear them advertise, Sunday, Sunday, the Little Bastards Fun Day. That was the children's show on Sundays. And there was a woman in it named Molly Brown, who's gone on to make interesting horror films in London, and a young man named Eric Forsberg, who was, I'm going to say something about his parents in a minute. And the lead in it was George Wendt, who went on to be Norm on Cheers. And John Goodman was the drummer on that show, which is so amazing that you're here. Thank you. So anyway, it was 3 years ago. I hope I know more than I did then. I hope that if I get something wrong, you'll just yell it out. But I've found that there's an astonishing amount to learn. And now that the book is done, that's the book there. That's why it took 4.5 years. But now that it's done, what I'm finding is there's ever more to learn. And there's ever more, not just about the history, but all the new stuff that's happening too. So I've found it an incredibly exciting process. And what I want to do with you today is share some of what I learned. Normally in a situation like this, what you do is the author reads from his or her book. And because this is an oral history, and this is told exclusively almost in the first person, I'm going to let the people speak for themselves. All right? So I'm going to play some of the audio clips from some of those interviews. When I started, because John and I started in the 70s, I thought the the book would start in the 70s. I thought that's when everything really started happening. Steppenwolf was starting to happen there, and Remains Theater was happening. But I interviewed a woman named Joyce Piven. Do you know Joyce Piven? I'm seeing some nods. If you know theater, you know her name, and the name of her husband too, Bern Piven. And they opened a theater workshop in the 70s. They don't know the exact date themselves, that's why I say the 70s. And I thought, okay, I'll interview her. I got hold of her book. It's called In the Studio with Joyce Piven. And I learned that back in 1953, there was an awful lot happening, and it was just beginning to happen. And before that, nothing was really going on except touring shows. It was mainly touring shows and some summer stock and Drury Lane farther out. But in 1953, a guy named Paul Sills started something called Playwrights Theater Club at the University of Chicago. And I'm going to play a clip from Joyce, and she's going to mention it, so I want you to know what that was. She completely changed my mind about where this story should start. Completely changed my mind. I left her apartment the first time thinking, I'm going back to 1953. It has to start there, and that is where the book starts. This audio clip is probably my third visit to see her. And what I did was I emailed people and I Facebooked people and said, I'm going to see Joyce Piven. Is there anything you want me to share with her? And I read her some of those comments. And so that's what I'm referring to here.
And the reason I keep coming back to you is because I think this
I'm
is...
the last man standing.
Yeah. And that who's still here in Chicago, too.
Yeah.
It's just, well, okay, one more quote. This is Bill Williams. But I said, when I sit down, this is me, when I sit down to talk to Joyce Piven, and then he interrupted me, and he said, that's the lifetime. That is the whole lifetime of Chicago theater.
That's the lifetime.
Because if you think about before playwrights,
There was nothing.
there was nothing.
There was a couple. I heard about them, but I was young. I didn't want to hear about that. We were creating a new theater. We wanted to be original and revolutionary. And that's what I think it was. But I think that's why people in theater don't want to look back. I had been reaching a time in my life where my feeling was, when I'm gone, there are going to be a lot of memorials. Mm-hmm. And I'm here now.
Yes.
You know, it was, I had a what's it all for moment. What's it all for? You know. And I'm not sure what it is I want. I just want, I would like for people in the theater to acknowledge their roots.
That had a profound effect on me personally. I've found her extremely moving ever since I first talked to her, and that's why I kept going back too. And my wife and I are going with the book to LA in a couple weeks, and we're going to meet up with Joyce. She spent most of her lifetime here. About 2 years ago, she moved to LA because her health is failing, and she wanted to live closer to her children, and so her adult children. So that's how we're going to connect with her. But imagine the impact of hearing that. She was desperate that that part of the story be told. This story about what happened before Second City, before all the things that we're familiar with. And that's what I tried to capture in the opening chapters of the book. This Playwrights Theater Club, by the way, if you don't know about it, look at this cast. These are the people who got their start there. Ed Asner, he first started doing acting there after he got out of the Army. He was very young. Barbara Harris, who went on to all kinds of movies, Thousand Clowns, Nashville. That's a photo from Nashville. She started there. Mike Nichols and Elaine May started there. Fritz Weaver. Does anybody remember Fritz Weaver? Famous film actor. And whoops, I'm not using my own computer, so sorry. The last one that flashed by, almost a subliminal message for you, is a man named Sheldon Patinkin. And he was 17 years old working at Playwrights Theater Club, running the lights there. He became an extremely influential character in Chicago. He was a director at Second City for a number of years. And Francis Guinan, who was an actor at Steppenwolf, told me that if you have not worked with Sheldon Patinkin, you have worked with somebody who has worked with Sheldon Patinkin. He was just all over everywhere. Unfortunately, he died like 4 months before the book began, and I never got to talk to him, but he's a remarkable character. The thing I wanted to share with you too today is why I call the book Ensemble. There are two notions to this. One is, there are a lot of ensembles in Chicago. There's Steppenwolf, obviously, is one of the most famous. There's Looking Glass is an ensemble. Black Ensemble Theater, obviously. All of these companies that are ensembles here. But here's the thing that I found really remarkable. The city, the community here, operates as a kind of ensemble where they help each other out. There is a strong notion that all, tides rise. How's that go? This is my helper today. Thank you. Rising tide lifts all boats. That sense is very much here. And I'm going to share with you a clip that illustrates that in just a second. The way the book is set up is, I don't know if you can see it from there, but it's almost like a play where at the top there on the right, Julia Louis-Dreyfus says something. She might say, the place I met my husband Brad at Northwestern University was blah, blah, blah. Next line, Brad says something about, I remember meeting Julia. I was taken by her energy and so forth. So the whole thing reads like a kind of play that way. That reinforces for me the notion that it is an ensemble. They are telling their collective story together. You see what I mean? As opposed to all sorts of separate interviews. So I'm going to play a clip. This is a gentleman named Derek Sanders, who has started something called Congo Square Theater with a friend of his. And they're still going today. But he told me a story about the way Steppenwolf helped them, and I think helped Congo Square, and I think it helps illustrate this notion that Chicago operates as a kind of ensemble. So here's Derek.
Let me tell you a story. Can I tell you a real quick story?
Yeah, I do.
So, we were doing Showtime's Come and Go, right? And we did it with the Goodman, a co-production with the Goodman. At the time, we are in rehearsal. My executive director comes to me and says, we run out of money. Before we even hit set. Like, this is maybe a week or so before we hit set, right? And he said, I don't know how we're going to finish the set. I don't know how we're going to get this up. Then out of the blue, Amy Morton calls me and says, hey, Derek, can you come down to Steppenwolf? I'm in rehearsal, but I would love for you to, I need to talk to you. And I love Amy. I love Amy Morton, right? And if Amy calls me, I'm going to come, And I said, sure, Amy, I'll come down there and meet you. Sure. So I go down there. Amy comes down and says, hey, Derek, I was a part of a theater company called Remains. And we had always talked about, getting back together, and we just never did, but we kept our account open. And he was like, and we were looking around at the Chicago landscape, and companies we felt like symbolized the work that we did. And she handed me a check and said, we want you to have a piece of Remains. Right? I almost cried. That sent us over the top. I think it was like $10,000 or something like that. And that was just enough to get us through tech and to get us through one of our more amazing productions of our company's history, right? That to me symbolizes what Chicago community is really about. Yeah. To me, it's one of those things where a company like Remains can reach back to a company of color that they didn't know. They didn't know they would know. And she didn't know we needed it desperately. She didn't know any of that. And it was just one of those things that I'm deeply proud of. It's just one of those moments that I go, that's why I'm in Chicago. That's why I did Chicago theater, because of stuff
even more remarkable is the fact that this is just one of dozens and dozens and dozens that I heard that were similar to that. A quick note to David, if you want to bring down the sound, go ahead, because I can't find it on your laptop. Okay. Lots and lots and lots of stories like that. I'm going to give you one more. There was a gentleman named Nathan Allen who came to town as a young man with some of his friends from college, and they started a company called the House Company, which is going very strong right now. He did a show, and it was called The Death and Harry Houdini, which is a play he wrote. They just put it up. That's the way it works in Chicago. Let's find a space. Let's put on a show. Who shows up but a woman named Laura Eason, who was one of the founders of Looking Glass Theater. And she now, well, not anymore, but very recently was one of the head writers for House of Cards on Netflix. But she saw that play by this little company. And she called up Nathan Allen, and she said, hey, the work you're doing really interests me, and it's similar to what we're trying to achieve. Do you want to have coffee? They had coffee. He told her what we're planning and so forth. And she said, you have to meet my mentor. And she took her to meet the artistic director of Steppenwolf Theater, Martha Levy, who's a major figure. And he just couldn't believe he was there. They became very good friends. She became a very good supporter of house theater, to the point where when Martha died not that long ago, Nathan was doing Death and Harry Houdini in Florida somewhere, maybe Miami. They were on tour. And when Martha died, he asked that Miami theaters dim their lights in honor of her, which he said, just to stay connected. That's powerful to me. He once asked one of the other administrators at Steppenwolf, why were you so nice to us? Why did you even do that? And the administrator's name was Kurt Columbus, said, because it's the rule. And I think that's true. I find that a lot. As I mentioned, I'm going to LA soon. I'm going to go to New York soon. I keep telling this story to Chicago audiences, and they get it. I have no idea how the coast will receive this, but it'll be interesting to see how they think about it. This notion, though, that the whole city is an ensemble and people work together goes way back. Do you know Alan Arkin? Alan Arkin goes way back. I remember as a kid watching The Russians Are Coming, a movie I just loved, Heart is a Lonely Hunter, Catch-22, all the way through to the Kaminsky, the Kaminsky method. The Kaminsky method, which he stars on some channel with Michael Douglas. So he's had this great career. And I talked to him a couple years ago, and I said, well, how do you look back on your days in Chicago? Because he came here in 1960 to be a part of the Second City cast. Nobody knew who he was at all. Nobody had any idea who he was. And here he is, many, many, many years later, quite a few decades later, looking back on his time in Chicago. And I think you'll find it as profound as I do.
One of the things I think about periodically, I think that a lot of you maybe it would have been smarter had I stayed in Chicago. Because exactly what you're talking about, there was a sense of us against the world, a sense of family that was really genuine when I was in Second City. And I've looked through that my entire career, founded maybe 6 or 8 times. But not nearly as much as I could have had I stayed there.
Back when I could sit in a movie and then watch it like 2 or 3 times because they wouldn't pick you up. Russians are coming to one of those that I just kept watching. There's something.
Yeah, well, the Russians Are Coming was an extension of Second City in a way, but was Norman Jewison had a brilliant and very embracing philosophy of film. Everybody, it was a community project. We were all doing it for the same reason. It had enormously important social significance for us, all of us. And so
he says, I wonder if I should have stayed in Chicago. That sense of us against the world, that sense of family, he said, was very real. And he went on to say, when you think of that illustrious career, he went on to say, I've looked for it for the rest of my career and found it 6 or 8 times. I just find that quite remarkable. And says something very special about Chicago, too. He thinks very fondly of that time. Laurie Metcalf at Steppenwolf Theater. She was just in Lady Bird a couple years ago. She's now a recipient of 2 Tony Awards for her appearances on Broadway. She's done a lot of work. A lot of people know who she is now. But there was a time when she was working in a Highland Park basement with the Steppenwolf Theater Company. And she, too, looks back very fondly at that period of her life when they were all just playing around in that little basement and could, just try to see, how am I going to make Gary laugh? How am I going to impress John Mahoney or John Malkovich? And I asked her, so were you guys thinking about yourselves as an ensemble at that time, at the beginning? And this is what she said.
Were you using the term ensemble early on?
I think we did. I think very early on we just called ourselves Steppenwolf Theater Ensemble, maybe. I think we used it. If we didn't use it formally, it was always in our head that what we did was as a group. Nobody thought, I'm going to use this as a platform for myself.
Really?
Mm-mm.
It was really all about the group then.
It was about the work. About the work. It was about how we're going to make this the best thing possible. It was collaborative from the beginning. We wanted to make an impression not individually but as a group. And so we knew we had energy, we had passion, we had a shared sense of humor, and we wanted to we wanted the group to succeed.
That's a powerful notion, isn't it? In terms of, if you think now in terms of a theater company and there's somebody who's really good and they just want to be a standout, that diminishes the whole group. And Steppenwolf's success, in part, comes from we wanted the group to succeed. We wanted the group to succeed. I love the social element of that, too. I was asked to speak before a group of school administrators in district somewhere. And in Elgin, I thought you would help me out on that one. In Elgin. And what they wanted me to talk about is how groups work. And I said, I don't know how groups work, but I could share with you how successful theater companies worked. And I took these clips, and it seemed to have an effect on them. The idea that this isn't about any one of us shining. This is about we want the group to succeed. I love that notion. Here's another thing I wanted to share with you. Does anybody remember the critic Linda Weiner? Does anybody remember her? She's kind of long gone, but she was here in the 70s. And she was here at the very beginning. Then she went to New York and started writing there, and recently retired. But, you know what I should tell you, just as a footnote? I had a play at Victory Gardens. It was a one-act play, a little bitty one-act play, and she came and reviewed it. And she gave me the best review I've ever gotten for a play, because I got very few. She said, not bad for an unknown Evanston playwright. So I used that blurb as much as I can. But this is Linda Weiner talking about those very early days in Chicago and what that was like. That was for Laurie.
The first new play I reviewed in Chicago for the Tribune was Man at Stuck Variations, and was his first play in Chicago, I think 1972, something like that. And we all grew up in public together.
All grew up in public together. What do you mean by that?
Well, there they were, the whole Chicago theater movement, having its growing pains and its
No place to hide. It's
there
hard to
was
hear.
a moment, and I was lucky to be sort of kind of at the tail end of it, when something extraordinary happened. You know, that moment with that Richard Christensen recording, when all these people coalesced and really didn't, you know, have an idea of what was, you know, what they were achieving, but they knew they needed to do it. Not just Steppenwolf, but, you know, the people at the Body Politic, you know, the people who formed all these different companies, and who did theater. You know, one of the things that when I think about it, you know, when I have a physical memory of it, is going to all these places that didn't look like theaters. You know, all these back rooms and all these, you know, like going to the Victory Gardens was the Metro.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that still happens to some extent. They didn't have the mystique at the time, but they had the values. And they, which I guess eventually turned into a mystique. But I don't know where I'm going with this. It's just that something, well, I guess this is it, that, you know, something extraordinary did happen. And I think the resonances from that have persisted. And to some extent turned into now nostalgia and sentiment. But I think that they also established an ethos that's remained important. And I think that, like, when someone, we know when someone's violating that.
One of the things I like about what he did there, what he said there, and I heard a little chuckle, but this is something I learned about doing oral history, where he said, I don't know where I'm going with this. That's an interesting human thing that happens. And I could easily have edited it out, but I find it really interesting. Because I don't know where I'm going with this. Obviously, he's exploring ideas, and then he came up with it. And I like that kind of moment, you know. So I tried to preserve some of that in print, too. He talked about an ethos that, you know, he and Linda were talking about where it started, you know, in these little storefront theaters. And we have storefront theaters all over the place that are doing phenomenal work. Absolutely phenomenal work. The Gift Theater, which is in which previously had been a shoe store in Jefferson Park, is now seats about 45 people. And there's an international playwright named David Rabe, who wrote Streamers and a number of other things, who premiered his new play, at Gift Theater. That tells me something. A 45-seat theater. He workshopped it there, he worked on it, and then it went to Broadway. And then they didn't use the original cast, they used another cast, but that's another story. One of the things that Tony says at the end of that clip, too, is that when somebody violates that ethos, we know it. And that's why I showed this slide, Profiles Theater. This was a really difficult time in Chicago theater's history, and it was just a couple years ago. And I don't know if you remember seeing this in the news. But what ended up happening was there was an artistic director at Profiles who was very charismatic. And he took that whole Steppenwolf thing of, we just go to the wall with this thing. You know, if I'm going to hit you, I'm really going to hit you. And that stuff that was part of Steppenwolf, that they used to call it rock and roll theater, which Amy Morton hated that term, or, you know, in-your-face theater, which they don't use anymore. But he took it to an extreme and then abused it. And women, little by little, started saying, you know, there's a director you really shouldn't work with, and this is why. He was sexually abusive to some of his cast members. He used his power over cast members. He was violent on stage, and nobody wanted to say anything about it. And part of the reason was there were young women coming into these companies that are like, well, is this what theater is? I don't know. And somebody told me that they started writing on the walls in the bathrooms and bars, do not work with so-and-so. The Chicago Reader got hold of this story, started to investigate it, and it was extremely serious. And they did a whole expose on this, ran it through the lawyers like crazy, interviewed the women who were quite nervous about this coming out. The day that story came out on in the Reader, the Chicago theater community came together, and what you see here, those are all copies of the front of the Reader. They plastered the front of the theater with that story. And they said, no more. You can't do this here. And that artistic director is long gone. He skipped town. Nobody knows where he is. And that theater closed down the next day. I think that's an incredible demonstration of what happens when the community comes together. Out of that, there were two women started something called Not in Our House that continues to exist today. They got together, everybody who was concerned about it, they created this organization called Not in Our House, and out of that came the Chicago Theater Standards, which means if there's an intimate scene, an intimate sexual scene on the stage, everybody has to give permission. Every part of it is choreographed, and there are all these rules. A woman named Linda Fisher, told me, in theater, those of you who are in theater will know this, if you have a violent scene, a sword fight or a knife fight, they rehearse that every single day. Every time there's a show, you have to. It's part of the protocol. You have to run it and make sure everybody's safe and everybody's okay. She said for sexual scenes, nothing. Nothing. So that's what they created, and that came out of this. I think that says something about a community, too. All right. Lest you think I'm over-romanticizing this whole thing of the Chicago ethos, there's still a lot of work to be done here. There's still a lot of work. And a playwright named Ike Holter, who I just think is doing some excellent work, had an interesting comment for me, and I want to share this with you. He talks fast. He's just a fast talker, so tune into him, and I can help you with it when it's done.
I think the city knows it's a work in progress, and I think that's exciting.
Okay, I'll tell you what he said there. There's a lot of background noise. He said, a lot of cities think they're done, but Chicago sees itself as a work in progress. You can see if you can tune into this. It's very brief.
Some cities think that they're all the way there and nothing can take them down, where Chicago is always, I think, cautiously moving towards progress and was falling down sometimes, but the idea of we're not at the end point is important, I think. But I think that's what the best cities are. They're always changing and hopefully trying to get better. But yeah, it has a feel of like, okay, cool, so we're all doing this, right? Instead of like, it's done. Everything's great. Everything's not great.
Boy, I need to clean up that clip. Forgive me. This is what he was talking about. Chicago sees itself as a work in progress. Everything is not great. Things need to be fixed. But we all sort of are in it together. One of the things Ike is often outspoken about is racial disparity and opportunities. And Chicago theater is always pushing those boundaries too. There's I read this really neat book. It's an oral history too, called Black Theater's Black Life by Harvey Young. And in it, I came across this. Down at the bottom, 2007, J. Nicole Brooks, playwright and director, becomes the first black ensemble member of Looking Glass Theater. 2007. That's not that long ago, right? So I said to Nicole's become a friend, and so I talked to her and I said, "Did you know you're in Harvey's book? That you're part of a historical timeline?" And this is how she responded.
Holy shit, that is true. Hey, I'm not mad about it. Thank God I'm not the only. Thank God. I mean, I'm the only black female, but there are other people of color in the company, and increasingly we need that to be the case, to have way, way more, but I didn't even think about it that way. That's so interesting.
So can you tell me the story of when they bought the Ensemble?
Oh my God. I remember it like yesterday. I had written a play called Black Diamond, The Years the Locusts Have Eaten. It premiered in April of 2007. Fast forward to Black Diamond opens, And there's this fancy gala that they have every year. They invited me to it. And they're like, you know, Nikki, what time are you coming to the gala? Okay, I'll be there at 6:30. Make sure you're there. Make sure you're there. So I get to the Peninsula Hotel. It's all fancy to do. And they're like, hey, Nikki, come on out. You know, there's like one person, I'm going to talk to you on the veranda outside. I'm like, sure. And I think it was Phil Smith. Phil leads me outside, and the entire ensemble is there. No one else is out on the veranda. All the fancy people are inside. And I'm like, oh, hey, guys. All 21 of you, what is it? Yes, they had this, like, everybody, like, they all have swallowed a canary. They were just, they're swimming in it. Yeah. Dude, they're all sitting there, standing there with these shit-eating grins. And Catlin, who was artistic director at that point, said we would like to invite you to become an ensemble member. And I was a hot mess from that point on. Like, I wept. I openly wept. I laughed. I thought no, oh my God, are you kidding me? Like, no, there's no way. I thought I already, for me, I won. I got to develop and create a play. Then it happened to get produced. Then it happened to do really well, and I don't mean like well in the numbers and critics, who cares about all that. It did well because they had never had that many Black people on their stage ever. Let me just go ahead and be blunt and say about it.
What a moment.
It blew my mind. And they were and they just embraced me, and it's been a love affair since. I love every single one of them, I really do. So that's how I became an ensemble member.
I want to call your attention to the fact that Nicole is opening her brand new play, which is called Her Honor Jane Byrne, in February next year. She's directing it, and she's written it too. And it's about when, if you remember, when Mayor Jane Byrne moved into Cabrini Green for a short time, that's the subject matter she's taken up. I listed just 3 plays that she's directed or been in. She's done a tremendous amount more work. I mean, I couldn't put them all up there, but she's an amazing force. She was just in an Ike Holter play at the Goodman called Lottery Day and was absolutely sensational in it. But it's important they get opportunities. You know, it's important that opportunities are equitably distributed as well, and that's one of the things that Chicago's working on. Lastly, I'll close out with the person I began with, and that's Joyce Piven. With her is Jen Green. I'll show you a picture. Okay, that's Joyce, obviously, and then the other woman is Jen Green. She is now the artistic director of the Piven Theater Workshop. So she's the very first next generation to take the mantle from Joyce. And when you think back, Joyce was all the way back there with Paul Seals and Ed Asner and Nichols and May in 1953, and she's just passed it on to Jen. And this interview was the last one I did in this city. She was just about to move to LA. And I asked both of them if they could articulate what the other has taught. You know, they each taught each other. What did you, Jen, learn from Joyce? And Joyce, what did you learn from Jen? And this is what they said.
You know, Joyce taught me how to live a life in the theater. Joyce taught me something about the long haul of the theater and how obligated we are to the next generation and how obligated we are to create something beautiful while we're here. I would be very lucky, right, if I could do what we did.
Yes.
And I'd be very, very lucky.
Me too.
Yeah. For whatever reason, you know, what you saw could bring this work to the next generation. And I hope that I have the same presence of mind and the same openness and the same ability to receive, to see that next person.
think I've learned a different kind of patience from Jennifer. Jen always, in a funny way, brings me back to the work. I want to get there, wherever there is. We can only aspire.
Is there a way you feel like the community over-romanticizes itself? Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, the reverential sense of community, the reverential sense of where we may not have the money, but boy, we got love, you know.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, but that's how you keep a community together too. You know, it's like any community's self-definition. Some of it's true and some of it isn't. But enough of it is true so that it has meaning.
Yeah.
And I think it still has meaning.
That phrase, I talked to Tony very early in the process, and that phrase really helped me as I was doing oral history. You know, everybody has their own version of the story, and you have this kind of Rashomon effect as you put it together. And we do sort of over-romanticize it, but I love that. Enough of it is true so that it has meaning. If you'll indulge me, just one last thing. I wanted to share with you how this all started with me. Do you know Stud Sturkle?
Yeah.
Mark Larson, the Stud Sturkle. You know, right here, peace. You know, it's very sturdy. Yeah. Kind of have the book somehow. You yourself, your thoughts. So, if you can call me, we'll wait to the ring sometime. No immediate rush on what we're doing. It's for the book. It'll take a while, but we'll set a time. You know, pretty soon. You know, when you're free, and I'm free, we do it. So I'm a 565-5025. I'm not interested in the messaging to be in touch. I think the best to be in it. And you're yourself, you too, your own thoughts and everything. Okay, great. Thank you.
1990, that phone call meant a lot to me. That's all I've got, and I'm right on time. Sure.
Thanks so much for such an interesting talk. I, as a theater ignorant person, and mostly because my husband falls asleep when he sits still, I would love to understand, and it may not be that interesting, when the big Broadway in Chicago stuff happens and these big shows come through, how much of that is local people? How does that interface with the sort of more local neighborhoody, the little ones that are near me kind of theaters? And is that helpful to the theater scene in Chicago to have that, or is that kind of a distraction, or how do those two things relate?
That's a great question, actually. It's a really interesting question. You got it.
She wins.
She does win, and we don't even need another contestant. Do you know what Broadway in Chicago is, what she's referring to? They bring these big shows in. That was actually started by a local person here who used to work in the ticket booth at Candlelight Dinner Theater when that was still around in Summit, Illinois. In fact, she helped them, figure out how to do a box office. They didn't even know it at that time. It was started by a local person, which is great. A lot of times, the other part of your question is, who do they bring in? Are they bringing in, the touring companies? Yes, they are. It's like that. But there's a great theater, tiny theater called Timeline. That is at the Wellington Church, and it's about to move to another space. But they have a tiny, tiny space where they do big things. And P.J. Powers, who's one of the founders of that, told me, from the beginning, we decided we were always going to act like we were bigger than we were. That was a guiding principle. We'll act like we're bigger than we are. And it's really worked, because if you go to Broadway in Chicago right now, a play called Oslo is now part of Broadway in Chicago. It's put on by Timeline, directed by a Timeline director. So that could be a big change that's going to happen, because we've got incredible people here. Who else? Yes? Oh, you choose. I'm sorry.
How does Joyce feel about her son?
Let him go. That's okay.
That was my false cue. I'm sorry. My bad.
There's some older, venerable theater companies, and then there's a new generation of actors. Does it ever become necessary to clean house or to oust the oldies but goodies in order to bring in some fresh blood?
You know what I think? I think that happens naturally. I don't have the inner workings of a theater that's let people go. I don't think that's something they would have shared with me, but it happens naturally. Steppenwolf is a really interesting example because it's been around so long, right? When's the last time you saw Laurie Metcalf or Jeff Perry or John Malkovich on that stage, or Terry Kinney or Gary Sinise, who started there? They've moved on to huge careers elsewhere, and now it's all new blood, and they're very diligent about bringing in new blood. Other Looking Glasses talked to me too about when we did Alice in Wonderland the first time. We were younger, we could do all these things. Now we have families and we're older, and we can't do that stuff. We've got to bring in new blood. So that's what I mean by it's kind of a natural evolution in a way. You know what I mean? I would bet, though, there are people who are sort of pushing out the old. I mean, it happens. But I can't give you an example of it. Does that answer your question at all? Yeah.
Mark, how does Joyce feel about her son Jeremy, who far outshines her in recognition, and it's how he's a household word with all his TV and movie success? Jeremy Piven.
She is extraordinarily proud of Jeremy Piven. The second time I talked to her, she had just gotten back from London, where he was shooting the very last Selfridge. He has shot the last Mr. Selfridge. She was out there. She was boasting the whole time. She's very, very proud of him. I think, though, telling tales out of school, Byrne, his father, had more trouble with that. I've heard stories about that a lot. Byrne had passed before I was able to talk to him, but a lot of people have mentioned that, and I could see that happening. It's like Daedalus and Icarus. But Joyce, is she proud? And of her daughter, too, I should say. Shira Piven, her daughter, is a television director. She's directed for Transparent, for One Mississippi. She directed a wonderful film with Kristen Wiig called Welcome to Me that I just adored. So Shira's doing very well, too.
Yeah, thanks for your talk and for your work. I was wondering, though, what intrigues you personally about theater, and what engages you in it, and makes you want to devote your life to it, even though it's a difficult way to describe.
It is. Ever since I was a child, I've been really fascinated by theater. I just have been fascinated by it. And I think I always assumed that I would go into theater. I didn't ultimately. I tried it, Second City, and Victory Gardens did a play of mine. And then I worked for a gentleman named Bert Tillstrom, who did Kukla, Fran, and Ali. And I worked with him in the later years of his life when he was doing live shows. But then my wife and I had twin daughters, and I needed a real job. This is what you were alluding to. And I became an educator. I taught at Evanston High School for a number of years. Then I worked at the Field Museum, Lincoln Park Zoo, and then at the university level. But pretty much the day I retired from the university, I started this book. So I returned to it. What fascinates me about it is how incredibly vital it is. It's so different from sitting and watching a movie, and especially at these small theaters where you're as close as we are here. You just feel it in a whole different way, and I find that incredibly engaging, and I just can't get enough of it.
It was a wonderful presentation. I enjoyed your love and passion for it. My question has to do with how do you distinguish like great ensembles from the great plays that they're doing? Can a great ensemble actually make a medium play much better, or just if you can just tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yes. Steppenwolf, again, I keep going back to that, but they're kind of the one everybody thinks of, has done extraordinary things with not that great plays. Here's another example. David Cromer. Do you know about David Cromer? Local guy. Just got a Tony 2 years ago for The Band's Visit, which is now in Chicago. But he did a show in the basement of a place called The Den, which is a great multi-theater space. In the basement, he did Our Town. And as an English teacher, I thought, somebody said, you've got to see this. And Chris Jones loved it, and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, as an English teacher, I'm going to go see Our Town? I'm going to see Our Town again? What he did, he mined that thing for every nuance, and it was extraordinary what he did with it. And then that went off Broadway, and then to Broadway. And then his career started taking off. You know, yes, ensemble work can have a profound effect on an audience, and I don't think they even know they're being affected by it. Let me give you another quick parallel. Mary's in the back. That's why I keep pointing every time I say my wife. We saw a show in New York, which was an all-star show of Albee's Tiny Alice. And it was, I mean, really, it was Glenn Close and John Lithgow and Bob Balaban and all these great people. Individually, they were sensational. And you're wowed by these movie stars, but it didn't feel like an ensemble. It didn't have the same feeling to it. But when you see an ensemble work, I'm still looking for the words to describe the difference, and I don't have them yet. But it's palpable. It's there. So yes, they can take a play, maybe even a mediocre play, and really do something with it. I've seen it done a lot. There's people here too.
This is somewhat along the same lines. My impression is that one aspect of what makes Chicago theater distinctive is the occasional, at least, focus on spectacle or acrobatics, for example, at Looking Glass. And then maybe writers' theater focuses more on the textual quality of a play. And so I'm wondering if you could, are there theaters in Chicago that tend to move in one direction on that scale or in the other? And what's your assessment of that?
I saw a production of a play I really like called Good People. It's a wonderful play. And the first place I saw it was a large theater, and it had this phenomenal set, and it had moving parts to it. It was beautiful, and I liked it, and partly because I liked the play, you know. The next time I saw it, which was the same year, maybe 6 months later, was at a tiny little theater called Red Twist Theater. And they did it. They had almost nothing in the way of sets. It was very simple, and I was absolutely struck by it. It just broke my heart. The other was, that's a great spectacle. That's a great set. But I didn't feel it the same. You know what I mean? I don't know if that gets at what you're asking me, but that's how I was hearing it.
So does every theater have an ensemble? I'm thinking the Northlight, for example. We've had seasons tickets forever, too. They don't seem to have an ensemble, right?
No.
They just bring in actors.
Chicago Shakes doesn't. Chicago Shakespeare doesn't have one. Goodman doesn't have
Writers?
Writers doesn't.
Right.
But there's sort of, if you go enough, you'll see that there's sort of a de facto ensemble because they keep drawing on the same people. Northlight has Kate Fry right now, and everybody loves Kate Fry, and Northlight uses her a lot. But no, it doesn't operate in an ensemble the way Looking Glass does. They were all kids at Northwestern together, and they're still together, you know, and they operate in that way. That's very different. That's a good point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I was introduced to theater when I was about 10 years old at the Wagon Wheel Playhouse in Warsaw, Indiana. I started binging theater before Netflix even was thought of. My first experience in Chicago for theater, I'm from Central Indiana, was Gary Cole walking out of a shower completely naked.
Yeah.
I knew I was not in Indiana.
Yeah.
It was wonderful.
Yeah.
It was wonderful. Why are all these companies not on videotape? Why are they not preserved forever and ever for other? I would love to see True West with Malkovich, and some of these in the past. Why is that not being done?
It actually, well, there's two answers to that. One is it actually is. A friend of mine, Scott Silverstein, is part of a company called HMS Media, and they film a lot of stuff and they preserve it, but it's not for consumption yet. You're starting to write it down.
Yes.
But here, I'll give you something else to write down in just a second. So it is happening. The problem is it's extremely expensive. So some of the smaller companies are just propping up a little video in the background and saving them that way, but they're not for public consumption yet. Here's some good news, though. You can see the original True West with Gary Sinise and John Malkovich and Laurie Metcalf. American Playhouse filmed it years and years and years ago. I found it on YouTube, and it's absolutely as good as you would expect it to be. I was afraid I'm going to watch it and go, oh, they're so awful, and they're so young, and they didn't know what they were. Oh, my God, it's good. It's really good. So go to YouTube and put in True West Steppenwolf, and it'll be there. It's well worth watching.
Are there others?
Yes, if you go through YouTube, I can't think of one right now, but if you go through YouTube, some are there. But,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Two questions. Could you comment on the storytelling scene in Chicago? And also, an impossible question. What motivates an actor?
Wow. Thank you for saying it's impossible. It gives me an out. I'll get to that one in a second. I can't speak really to the storytelling scene. Do you know it very well?
Fairly well.
Is there something you'd like to share with everybody about that?
Well, it's very popular.
Yes.
Yeah, Moth is very popular. Story Lab. The Moth is very popular. Story Lab is very popular in Chicago. And a lot of people are getting into storytelling.
Yeah. The closest I come to that is a very dear friend of mine was Sid Lieberman, who is a well-known storyteller, did it all over the country and did it here quite a bit too. But it's not a scene that I was looking into with this, I'm afraid. But it's extremely important, and I think it's really on the rise too with things like The Moth. What motivates an actor? I heard a quote. Grant Wiggins said this, and this is in the field of education, but I think it's really strong. He said, there's no greater motivator than to get good at something you value. There's no greater motivator than to get good at something you value. And I think that's part of it. Mary and I just saw a show out at Trap Door where they seat 40, and it's in this tiny space. And at the end, they say, none of our actors were paid, so if you want to contribute something, but they just tore their hearts out. They were just totally into it. And I think it's because they want to get good at this thing that they value. That feels really good. That would be my guess. When I was working on this book, I never thought of making money on it or anything. I just wanted to figure out how to do it. And I see that kind of attitude among actors here, too. That's as close as I can come.
I used to follow Stuart Gordon.
Oh, yes.
So whatever happened to him?
Stuart Gordon is
the reason I'm asking is you kind of said this basement scene.
Yeah.
That was the first I saw, and it was a basement. They were in a basement. They did Ulysses.
That's right.
It was fantastic. So I followed him, and you talk about nudity. I forgot what the thing was about, but there was a nude scene of him with his wife.
Yeah.
And
that's
the end of my story.
Well, on the topic of nudity, since you keep wanting to go there as a group, Stuart Gordon, who started organic theater in Madison, at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, he started there doing all sorts of crazy stuff, and one of them was a production of Peter Pan that Andre DeShields was in, who just got the Tony for Hadestown. But they did it, and there were, on the campus, there were 4 nude dancers in it. And that was such a thing. That was so shocking at that time, and on this campus, that what ended up happening was somebody sat in the front row and said, I'll take pictures of your show for you, and then I'll give you prints of it if you'll let me sit in the front row and take pictures. And they said, oh, that's great, because that's expensive to do, especially then. And the guy sat there. It turns out he was a stringer for AP. And he sent those pictures out. They went all around the world, literally all around the world. In America, they were printed with the bar across the breast. And in Europe, they just printed the nude pictures. Johnny Carson got hold of this story and was making jokes about the nude Peter Pan at Organic. So Stuart must have figured out pretty early, well, that works. That's a great way to get attention. But he came here then, and he did Warp. He did all these wonderful productions. Warp went to New York. It lasted 6 days, but it did go to New York, to Broadway, the Ambassador Theater. Bleacher Bums, which was Joey Mantegna's idea. Wonderful stuff that they did. Bob Falls says something in the book about the work that Stuart Gordon was doing. It's nothing like what I do. Bob Falls is the artistic director of Goodman for many years. But he showed me, I love this line, he showed me what Chicago theater can be and what it can do. It really stretched it for him. What's he doing now? Real quick. He was a screenwriter for Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and then whatever the follow-up to that was. He's done a number of movies. He's in LA. That's where I interviewed him. So.
Thanks for your talk. I wonder how many of us were here 3 years ago for your last talk. Anybody?
I was afraid to ask.
Anybody here? Okay. I was just curious about that. In the Chicago area, we have dozens of universities, colleges, and junior colleges that are teaching theater and doing theater. And I'm wondering about the relationship between professional theater in Chicago and all those students.
It's to varying degrees, but it's a powerful connection. There's a company called Jackalope that was started by students at DePaul. Looking Glass Theater was started at Northwestern. Columbia College has lots and lots and lots of people come out of it, including David Cromer, who I just mentioned, who directed Band's Visit. And one of the things that Columbia is really good at, better than the others, I think, in terms of a relationship with the city, is they bring in practitioners mostly. Northwestern does too. Mary Zimmerman teaches there. But the idea of bringing practitioners in to work with the students. So they teach a class in directing or something, and then they go off and they direct the play that they're doing in the city. So you get some real strong practical advice. Plus you get to see your professor working. Part of it too, they teach a course called History of Chicago Theater, and part of the requirement is you go see shows in Chicago. So there, like I say, it's to varying degrees, but there certainly is a relationship there. And a lot of people are coming out of colleges now saying, I want to be the next Steppenwolf. Let's get a band of our friends together and create a company. And it happens a lot.
Could you say a little more about Chicago as the birthplace of improv? Do you think that's true?
It is true. I think it's true, and I know it's true. Certainly there was improv. I mean, Commedia dell'arte, and there's all of that. But the idea of, even that though, they had stock characters. In Chicago, there was a woman here named Viola Spolin, who makes you gasp.
I met her.
Oh, you did? Do you want to tell us where you met her?
Yes, my dad, should I use a microphone?
Can you hear?
Okay. My dad was took a class at Second City, and they ended up having him be part of it, and he was in the same place with Alan Arkin and Barbara Harris, and I remember him talking about it. And I was in high school at the time, and he said, do you want to come and watch us work with Viola Spolin? So I went, I was in high school, and she was yelling at them. She was so mean to them. And
I've heard.
And I said, Dad, how can you do that? She's mean. And he goes, no, she was drunk.
Oh, well, that's okay then. I'm not sure what the inference there is. Viola Spolin wrote a book called Improvisation for the Theater. She was working with theater games, and she was playing with how do I utilize this? Her son Paul Sills, who was one of the 3 founders of Second City, really got taken with that work. And his daughter Aretha Sills has become a very good friend of mine, and she said that he attributed all that work to Viola, but really he's the one who showed the world how it can be utilized in the theater. And he did a lot of that. And Joyce, you saw him in some pictures with Joyce, because that was the Story Theater. Improvisation definitely started here with Viola Spolin. There's just no question about that. I just did I emceed an event at Hull House Theater, or at Hull House Museum, where it was a tribute to Viola and to Paul Sills. And much of the Sills family was there. Paul Sand, who started with them, was there. Dan Castellaneta, who does the voice of Homer Simpson, was there because he had worked with them. All these people have been profoundly affected by that. I don't know what the argument would be for another city where it started, and I haven't heard one.
Do you have an opinion about the Jeff Committee and its value? And do you have an opinion?
The Jeff Committee is getting a lot of heat these days, and maybe this is what you're referring to. The Jeff Committee, you know what that is? They give. It goes back to the '60s, but they give awards called the Joseph Jefferson Award to theaters, and so it's like our Tonys, and it happens every year, and it's in this big Drury Lane places where it takes place. But they've been taking a lot of heat recently because, well, here's an example. One director, 2 years ago when I was there, a director received an award for Best Directing, and he went up there and he said, "Jeff Committee, I love this, I love you, but I'm about the 90th white guy to get up here and accept an award." And the place went berserk. They just cheered for him. There's a real tension about that, and they're trying to figure out what to do about it. I don't know that they're being as successful as they can be yet. I think their intention is there, but it's a thing. And I think it's driving theaters too to keep forcing the issue. It's kind of like what Ike Holter was talking about. I admire the work. I mean. Jeff Committee members go to literally hundreds of plays a year. It's an incredible commitment, and it's a huge service to our city too. Michael Shannon is a major movie star now. He was just on Broadway too with Audra McDonald. You talk to him and he'll go, "I got a Jeff for that." It really means something. But I think, like Ike said, this is a city where we just keep working through it. We just keep working on it.
I'm going to take the last question, and it's a multi-part question. So how do you and Mary choose what you see and where you see it? And what would you recommend to any of us in terms of, particularly on a budget, seeing, kind of getting out there and seeing Chicago theater? Would you recommend like a subscription to a small neighborhood company, or kind of hopping around to different theaters?
It really depends on what you're in it for. We used to get subscriptions, but then we stopped doing it when I was working on the book because I just need to get more of a scattering of things. Some of the smaller theater companies are less expensive. You can also go to something called Gold Star, where they have cheaper tickets. There's Hot Tix too, run by the League of Chicago Theater for less expensive tickets. I would suggest heartily seeing some of the smaller theaters, especially if you haven't been to them yet. This thing at Trapdoor is very surrealistic. You just have to let it happen to you. But the commitment of these performers and this director is extraordinary. Trapdoor Theater. There's also something really interesting happening at Windy City Playhouse, if you know about that. They're doing immersive theater. And Mary and I just saw something there called Southern Gothic, where in this big warehouse, they have literally built a house. And you walk into the house, up the porch, and into a real living room, a real dining room, a real kitchen, and a real bathroom. And the play takes place there, and you're just a fly on the wall. And you can move from room to room. But something, when I first started watching this, I thought, how am I going to know what, there's an argument going on in the kitchen, there's something going on in the living room, and I'm standing here in the dining room. How am I supposed to follow this? But within 20 minutes or so, I was totally engaged in this story and what was happening. It's brilliantly done. And it's called Windy City Playhouse. And coming up, we're going to go see a show called Every Beautiful Thing with Rebecca Spence as the only character in it. And she tells this story, and while she's telling the story, she draws on the audience too, to engage. So they're doing immersive stuff that I think is really interesting. Rivendell is a wonderful theater. Do you know about Rivendell? It's another one that's very small. It's just as you're about to get onto Hollywood, right? But this is started by a woman, Tara Mullen, and the idea is, their little tagline is, it's women's work, which is, has a double meaning. So wherever they can, it's focused on the work of women. It employs women behind the scenes as well as on stage. And they do wonderful work there. Yeah, it's a good suggestion. Okay? Sorry.